So, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to start this new year's 2022 with this conference on the theme Climate Change Reason for Concerns and Hope. It's a part of our internationalization cycle. The health crisis we are going through has reminded us harshly that the consequences of our action are measured on a global scale. This is not an observation, it's an obviousness. Taking climate change into account in carrying out training research on economic development mission should no longer be a subject of debate, but rather a rule of defining our actions. For all of us, it's a state of mind. For you, students, this conference is a support for your future missions. I would like to thank speakers for their insight on these major themes. And I will now turn the floor over to the IMT students. So the student, if you are ready.
Estelle, it's up to you.
As the third event of our Sustainable Development Week, this video conference proposed by the Direction of International Affairs at IMT MINALPI and the Association Engineers for Sustainable Development gives to all of us the opportunity of a significant moment for all of IMT schools. Indeed, the T4C group, which is composed of the 8 IMT schools, have decided for the second time in a row to set up a common event about what is one of our major concerns: sustainable development and ecological transition.
And these are crucial issues related to our training and future jobs as engineers. This conference, open to all, will stand for the first event of the IMT Students' COP, called COP or Not COP, in French COP ou pas COP, to be continued until April. Each school will, by turns, organize an event and invite their counterparts. With Paola Arias and Christophe Cassou, we are, as students, proud to kick off our inter-IMT's event, COP ou pas COP.
Yes, thank you, Laurent. And I follow with something I would like to add, as I'm in charge today of ecological transition for IMT Group. And I would like to add that as engineering schools, one of our strengths is to focus on actions. And now, hopefully, with a positive and a real impact on industry, international and French industry. So IMT has settled a large roadmap on ecological transition and takes its own responsibility to become more and more a force of change in industrial field. So in particular, today and for the students, this generation of students are really demanding and they want acts. They are done with talking right now. So they want a real change. And in this call, they try to measure the impact of all the events they co-organize as this event. That's why they prepared a survey they will share with you at the end of this conference. And please help them measuring their impact by taking just the 5 last minutes of this conference to answer the survey they prepared for you. So this will definitely help them to target the best actions for the biggest impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you, IMT, our parent organization, to promote and support our events. Indeed, by targeting educators, current and future business executives, our goal in proposing the conference Climate Change, Reasons for Concern and Hope, is to show that business and the fight against climate change are not mutually exclusive. And that probably the best opportunities are and will be those that contribute the most to the preservation of the climate. This conference is part of our activity of internationalization at home. And following the conference we organized in 2020 and 2021 in the same remote format because of the pandemics, tonight's session is the first of 2022. And to my opinion, the messages that will be passed today, the messages of hope, hopefully stand for greetings and best wishes for this year and hopefully the following ones. We have today more than 280 participants, and I would like to warmly thank you, the audience, for its loyalty to the events that IMT Minalbi organized. We are very honored and also very proud to welcome today two renowned IPCC experts who recently contributed to the 2021 report on climate change. They are Paola Arias and Christophe Cassou.
So thank you. And Christophe Cassou, he's a CNRS researcher whose main expertise is on climate variability and climate changes, with strong interest in atmospheric dynamics, tropical, extratropical teleconnection, sea ice, ocean, atmosphere interaction. His studies combine both observational and modeling approaches and cover timescales ranging from sub-seasonal to multi-decadal, with a strong focus on the North Atlantic Ocean atmosphere. He has been working in CNRS since 2004, so almost 20 years, where he co-chaired the Climate Variability and Predictability Group within the climate team from 2009 to 2015. He led the French EPIDOM GICC project that aimed at coordinating the French contribution to the 5th IPCC assessment report in terms of decadal forecast. Since 2018, he is a lead author of the 6th IPCC assessment report. Overall, Christophe Cassou has authored 80 ranked peer-reviewed papers. So thank you, Christophe, to be here today.
And Paola Arias is an associate professor of the Escuela Ambiental from the engineering faculty of the University of Antioquia in Colombia, which is a partner of IMT. Her research focuses towards variability and climate change in the northern area of South America, with a special emphasis on the transport of atmospheric humidity and the connection between northern and southern hemispheres, including American monsoon. She's a leading author of Chapter 8 of IPCC 6 report on the changes of the hydrological cycle. Also, she acts as a coordinator author of the technical summary and the summary for decision makers. So thank you very much, Paola, to be with us today, and thank you, Christophe. So it's now, we'll give you the floor for the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Yes, pretty good.
Okay. Thanks very much. So thanks a lot for the invitation and for the opportunity to share with you the main outcome of the last IPCC report, and also thanks a lot for the original format of this webinar by gathering two authors from IPCC. Two authors from two different countries, two different continents, with two different cultures, and therefore possibly different perception of climate change, and also IPCC business, I would say. I guess we can come back to this issue after the formal talk we share with Paola. So I will start by introducing rapidly what IPCC is, so IPCC structures and IPCC prerogatives. And then Paola will present the main conclusions of the IPCC report, to which both of us contributed, as you said. And we conclude together with the last part, with what's the scope of the formal IPCC results, because climate change is not only a scientific problem, but of course it is a political problem, a socio-economical problem at world scale, at country scale, at community scale. And when Paola and I prepared this webinar, we got immediately on the same track, that we need to go beyond IPCC facts, but address also this socio-economical context of climate change. So let me see if I can. Yes, I can move my slides. So let us start with so I begin the webinar, and I will start with the IPCC, with this session that we call IPCC, and the sixth assessment report is in a nutshell. So very quickly, IPCC was created in 1988, so more than 30 years ago now. And IPCC produces periodically what we call assessment reports on climate science. And this term of climate science must be taken here in a very broad sense, as you will see after. So these assessment reports are the final products of assessment cycles that last about 6 to 7 years. And today we are in the we are finishing the sixth cycle with the publication of the sixth assessment report in 2021 and 2022. Special reports on dedicated topics have been also produced during this ongoing cycle. One devoted to the effect of warming at the level of 1.5 degree, and I guess you heard a lot about this special report that was published in 2018. And one dedicated on ocean and cryosphere changes, and the last one on the effect of climate change on land, including agriculture, biosphere, and so on. So the visual that you see on the screen shows what I would call the IPCC historical timeline with the dates of the report at the bottom. And we can see that each general report has fed the negotiation on climate policies listed at the top of the visual. So the most famous landmarks for these climate policies discussion are the Kyoto Protocol in 1995 and of course the Paris Agreement in 2015. Okay, so IPCC is divided into 3 working groups, and each of them publishes its own report. So Group 1 focuses on the geophysical basis of climate and climate change. This is the group where Paula and I belong to. And Group 2 deals with the impacts of climate change, such as the vulnerability of human societies and terrestrial and marine ecosystems. It also deals with adaptation. And finally, Group 3 assesses the possible solution to be implemented to mitigate climate change by reducing the emission of greenhouse gases from human activity. So I said at the beginning that climate science should be taken into a broad sense, and showing this decomposition into 3 groups. A cycle on IPCC report is just the compilation of all the 3 reports coming from the 3 working group, which is used at the end to write what we call a synthesis document, which closes the assessment cycle. So behind the term IPCC, there are humans, and especially authors, and a task force or support unit. And for this 6th cycle, which started in 2016 and finishing this year. So we are a team of 743 authors from 91 nationalities. And as I said, Paula and I belong to Group 1. So this Group 1 is composed of 234 authors from 65 countries, about a third of women and about 2/3 of the authors being new to the IPCC business. And this is the case for both Paula and I. Every 6 months, we all met. And this meeting were absolutely necessary to do in order to know each other, because I can tell you that writing an IPCC report is a scientific challenge, of course, but also a human adventure, considering the amount of work and the dedication that is required, and also the different culture between the authors. So it's really a human endeavor, I would say, and it's very important to meet. Unfortunately, of course, COVID hit us in many ways, and it has been a great how can I say, a great challenge to keep the inclusivity spirit alive since 2020, and we had to go to virtual meeting. It was not that easy, but we did relatively well, I think. We did well, and at least we did our best, and we managed in this situation to deliver our report in early August last year in 2021. And Group 2 and Group 3 will complete their own report respectively in February of this year and April of this year. So writing an IPCC report is like a marathon, or I should say, it's like an Ironman. And here is the path of this Ironman for the 6th cycle, which begins in 2015 with what we call a scoping meeting that brought together experts designated by governments and also organizations with the status of observers. The broad outline of the cycle and the report were defined during the scoping meeting. IPCC then approved the structure, and I appointed what we call the bureau of each working group. Then, on the right side of this schematics, authors are then nominated, and if I remember correctly, and Paola may correct me if I'm wrong, for Group 1 there were more than 1,000 names proposed for only 234 authors selected. And to be an author of IPCC, one should apply to what we call the focal point of each country, which is the correspondent of each country for IPCC. And it is the IPCC Bureau that makes the final selection according to criteria of expertise, gender balance, balance between so-called developed and emerging countries, and so on. Then we start the writing process with the drafting of 2 versions of the IPCC report before the final version. This is what you see on the graph here, and on the plot here. And I'm lost here. Yes, and what we do. So yeah, and this we call this version drafts, and for each draft there is a very strict revision process for the government. Okay, so I think I have a problem with my slides because I don't see my animation, but this is why I have some trouble here. But never mind. Okay. So yeah, we start the writing process, and so for each draft there is a very strict revision process. For the first draft, only experts are invited to review. For the second draft, comments are also open to governments who bring their own expertise, and the authors must respond to all the comments. It's mandatory, and for the sake of transparency and traceability, all the comments and responses are public as soon as the report is published. Then a draft of the summary for policymakers, what we call the SPM, it's written by a subgroup of authors and sent for comments to government mandated experts only. And a final version is produced and is discussed sentence by sentence. And here I insist on this word, sentence by sentence, during what we call an approval session that brings together the SPM authors and governments delegate, representing all the member states of the United Nations, so the 195 delegates. So each sentence of the SPM is approved at unanimity and reflects, therefore, a consensus between authors and delegates from the governments. All this process is controlled by independent observers, as I said before, mostly NGO, and a summary of the discussion is available online, ensuring transparency of the process. This is very important for the IPCC credibility to have this transparency. So the SPM is not written by governments, and its content is not largely modified by governments. The authors are accountable for the scientific integrity of the conclusions, both in substance and in form. And after the discussion with the government delegates. And this what we call co-building process helps make the SPM clearer and more accessible to a wider audience. And we can come back on this issue if you want after the talk, if you have questions about this IPCC process. So, so in total, at the end of this Ironman, we treated more than 78,000 comments, including all the drafts, more than 3,200 comments on the SPM for government delegates, and we evaluated more than 14,000 scientific publications. This is why I told you this is really an Ironman, and all of this is transparent and trustable. So I finished this first session of the talk by describing the process we follow as author to produce an assessment for any IPCC conclusion, because I think that it is very important to know that in order to interpret the conclusions properly. For a given issue, any type of question, for instance, is human influence responsible for the global warming? This is one issue that we had to tackle. We collect all the information, what we call evidence, and so all the information that we can find in the scientific literature. This is on the left side of this visual here, and these evidences are multiple, and they include results from observations, experiments, theory, statistics, models. So we compile all this source of information with evidence, and then we evaluate the evidence in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, and then determine whether the evidence are robust or not. And if they are robust enough, we can draw a conclusion and then provide a level of confidence for this conclusion. So this is really the pathway that we follow. The confidence level is chosen according to the nature of the evidence and its related scientific agreement. And here on this on the slide, it is shown. What is shown is a 2-and-3 table with an evaluation of the evidence on the x-axis, so the quality, for instance, of the evidence, and an evaluation of the consistency between the evidences on the y-axis. And so the more robust and the more consistent evidence are, the higher the level of confidence is. And we use 5 levels of confidence, which go from a very low confidence in light blue in this graph to very high confidence in the dark blue. And the last category in yellow on this plot here is what we call established fact, where there is, in that case, obviously no associated level of confidence, because there is a body of consistent and also independent evidences, so that the conclusion cannot be something different, something else, considering the actual state of knowledge. For instance, an established fact is the sky is blue. Okay. For the highest level of confidence, we finally, this is the last path, I would say, the last step of the pathway we follow. For the highest level of confidence, from medium to high confidence, we finally check whether we can go further and quantify our assessment in terms of probability, ranging from virtually certain, which is more than 95% of chance of occurrence, to exceptionally unlikely, which refers to less than 1% chance of confidence. And most of the conclusions we gave are ranked in between likely and very likely, which means 2 chance out of 3, or very likely more than 9 chance out of 10. Some concrete examples on this of this different conclusion that we can get. For instance, let's start with an established fact, which is very important. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the continents. And this sentence, which is a key conclusion of our report, has passed all the filters I described you to become an established fact. We've known for years that the climate was warming and that human activities was the cause of the warming, but the fact that is now and is considered as an established fact, which is materialized here by the word unequivocal, is very important because it is grounded on undisputable multiple lines of evidence, and it gives an incredible strength to the conclusion for the public. So in the previous report, there was a confidence level, a 95% confidence level that human activity was responsible for the warming. So for us scientists, it doesn't change much into if it's 95% level of confidence or if it's an established fact. But in terms of communication and usefulness of the messages, it is a huge step. Before going the floor to Paola, I need to go very quickly. I just want to conclude on this, which is to me an important slide, and which I entitled, "Don't make IPCC say what it does not say." And because we heard a lot about IPCC, what IPCC prescribes something, IPCC advocates something. IPCC is not prescriptive. Its only mission is to evaluate scientific, technical, and socioeconomical information, as I told you, to understand how the climate works, the risk associated with climate, and the option for action, adaptation, and attenuation. Also, what I showed you is IPCC does not conduct research, but provide an evaluation, a critical analysis of the state of knowledge on climate change and societal change. I have described all this process to you, and so IPCC report means to be the most objective and worldwide background of knowledge as aid for decision making and climate negotiation, for instance, for the Conference of Parties of the COP. And also something very important, and we can come back at the end, final choices for attenuation or mitigation and adaptation strategies are political and must be made by decision makers in a participatory, deliberative, and democratic context. And we think with Paola that is a framework that isn't so necessary to remember today. And just an example, for instance, in the French debate that we are having about the source of energy, I can read many times that IPCC is for nuclear power or for renewable energy. IPCC is not for or against nuclear power, nor for or against renewable energy. IPCC just synthesizes the scientific literature that is available on the subject. It synthesizes the scientific literature on energy transition trajectories and assesses the advantage and the disadvantages of the various options in the context of sustainable development objectives. So the choice is political. So don't make IPCC say what it does not say. I think it's very important. Now we turn to Paola for the main IPCC, for main result of our report.
Okay, so that now Christophe have already explained how the IPCC work. I want then explain what are the main insights in this sixth climate report. Climate report is the name that the report of the first working group received. Then the second group will have the adaptation report, and the third one will have the mitigation report. It is like a short name for the report. So the main finding, or one of the main findings in this report, is that the recent changes in the climate are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and are also unprecedented in thousands of years. So in order you have an idea how these changes are unprecedented for humanity, you can say, for instance, that CO2 concentration, which is now more than 410 parts per billion, is the highest CO2 concentration since at least 2 million years. So it means that we are the first human beings that are breathing air with this CO2 concentration. Also, sea level rise has the fastest rates in at least 3,000 years. The Arctic sea ice area has the lowest level in at least 1,000 years, 1 millennia. And also the glacier retreat is occurring in unprecedented rates in at least 2,000 years. So we can say that all of these changes are not changes during a few decades, a few years, but it's happening in centuries, millennia, and even millions of years, like the case of CO2 concentrations. Another important finding is that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. So this is like an important, let's say, input against denial of climate change, because human activity is the main cause of these changes, making, for instance, extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. So just to have an idea, we know, for instance, in Europe, you are living that every year, that extreme heat, for instance, is occurring with more frequency and intensity. Also, we know that heavy rainfall is occurring with more frequency and intensity in many regions of the world. Droughts are also increasing in frequency and severity in different regions. Fire weather, which means, for instance, dry, very windy, and also hot conditions, are increasing in different parts of the world. And also we know that ocean is changing, is warming. We know already that the warming of the ocean is due to human activity. But also, for instance, the acidification, the decreases in pH is very important, for instance, for ecosystems in the ocean, and also is losing oxygen. So we have an idea like what is the main cause of these changes, for instance, in cryosphere, in the ice, in the planet. Human influence is the main driver of hot extremes, which have become more frequent and more intense, ocean warming since at least the 1970s, and ocean acidification. We also know that the human influence is the main cause for changes in frozen areas of the planet. For instance, the global retreat of glaciers since the 90s, 40% decrease in Arctic sea ice since the 1979, and also decrease in spring snow cover since the 50s. So we already know, we already have confidence in the attribution of climate change. That is an area that has increased, has improved a lot during the recent years, and that is a big improvement between the 5th report and the 6th report, because now we are able to say that human activity is the main cause, not only of the warming of the planet that we know of as global warming, but also of the different changes in climate. And that is very important. Another important finding in this report that is very different from previous report of the Working Group 1 is that climate change is affecting every region on Earth. So it doesn't matter where you are located, it doesn't matter where you live, climate change is affecting your region, and it's affecting in different ways depending on the region. And the changes that we will experience will increase with further warming. So that's why it's very important to have mitigation of the warming. So just to show a little bit how is climate change affecting different regions of the world, I wanted just to show you that these are the more than 50 regions that we consider in this assessment report to divide the world. I will focus, for instance, here in my region, that is South America. We have 7 different regions, but you can see also in other continents, for instance, in Europe, that we have many regions that are selected according to climatology. So why is the reason why we do that? Is because we want to provide information that is useful for decisions related to risk assessment and adaptation. And also this report brings about 1/3 of the report is dedicated to regional climate information that is very important for decision making, as Christophe mentioned. So something very interesting that we did was that we tried to divide the continental regions that you are seeing here over all the continents using hexagons with the same size and the same type of hexagon to represent these regions, these continental regions, because our main idea was to show that regardless of the size of the extension of the region and regardless the location of the continental region, climate change is affecting every region. And for instance, one big step in this report is that we focus a lot on extreme climate and weather. So for instance, here you are saying all the hexagons, 45 hexagons in continental regions that try to shape the continental domains that we already know. For instance, these are the Americas. Here you can see Europe, you can see Africa and the other continents. And what you are seeing here is how hot extremes are changing since the 1950s. So you see that almost all hexagons are in red. It means that we have medium to high confidence that hot extremes are increasing in frequency and intensity in all these regions. And you also can see some dots. If you see 2 dots, it means that we have medium confidence. If you see 3 dots, it means that we have high confidence that these changes are due to human activity. So we know that hot extremes are increasing in frequency and intensity, but we also know with very high confidence that it is due to human activity. And you can say that almost all continental regions in the world are experiencing, during the recent decades, increases in hot extremes. When we go to the water cycle, that is rather complicated and it has a lot of feedbacks and interactions. We can see, for instance, for heavy precipitation, that is precipitation that is exceeding certain thresholds, that we have medium to high confidence of increases in frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation in the regions where you have the green hexagons. So you can say, for instance, that for Europe, we have medium to high confidence that heavy precipitation is increasing. But for instance, in the case of my region, that is South America, we can see that we only have that confidence for southeastern South America. Here is mostly Argentina and part of Brazil, where we have this confidence in these increases. However, if you see the rest of the hexagons are in gray. And you can also see that most of these gray hexagons are in the global south. And this means that we have limited evidence to say what is happening in heavy precipitation in these regions. It doesn't mean that it's not happening something. It may be changing, but we don't have enough evidence, and it's because we don't have enough data or we don't have enough literature assessing this. Because remember that the IPCC, what does is assess literature, doesn't create new literature. And when we go to the other part or the other extreme of the global water cycle, which is droughts, here we are seeing a type of drought that is related to soil moisture deficit. It's called agricultural and ecological drought. So you can see many yellow hexagons. It means that we have medium to high confidence that this type of droughts are increasing in those regions. So you can see, for instance, all these Mediterranean regions where we already know that this is happening. Also here, for instance, in this region in Europe, in many regions in Africa. And in the case, for instance, of South America, we can see here in northeastern South America, that is a very dry region. This is northeastern Brazil, where we have medium to high confidence in these increases in frequency and intensity of this type of drought. For the rest of the region, most of these regions, you can see that the hexagons are now white. And it means that we have evidence, but that the evidence has low agreement, because we have to check how consistent is the evidence. So in this case, it means that we have evidence, but maybe the regions are still too large, because droughts maybe could be more regional than the size that we are considering here. And this is also an invitation to provide further studies to understand what is happening with ecological droughts in these regions, where we can see the gray or the white hexagons. But also this IPCC report gives us important information regarding what is happening with temperatures and what could happen in the future. Something useful in this report is that gives us different scenarios that we can take into consideration. So here what we are observing is a mean global surface temperature. This are changes with respect to pre-industrial temperatures. And you can see here observations between 1950 and 2020. So you can see that temperatures have been increasing. And currently, we already have reached 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. If you remember the Paris Agreement says that we don't want to go above 1.5. Not at all above 2 degrees Celsius, and we can see now that we are already in 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. And then you are seeing different lines in colors that show different scenarios. These scenarios are related with not only CO2 emissions, but also, for instance, aerosol emissions, land use considerations, socioeconomical, in general, socioeconomical paths for development. So you can say that during the future, until the year 2100, that is the end of this century, you can see that different scenarios provide different temperatures. These red scenarios indicate a scenario with much higher CO2 emissions. That is what you are seeing in this other graph. You can see here what is the CO2 emission in gigatons per year of CO2, and you can see that the two red scenarios are the ones with the highest emissions, while this the light blue line indicates the only scenario that is actually consistent with the Paris Agreement, at least with the target with 1.5 degrees Celsius, not to increase temperatures above this level. So you can see that it is important the path we follow. It is important which path are we going to follow in future. And another thing that I wanted to show you about these main results of the IPCC report is something that is also novel in this report, because we consider a series of indices that we call climatic impact drivers. But here what I want to say is, with conditions in climate can conduce to impacts, for instance, in economy, for instance, in agriculture, for instance, for humanity. And we are going to see some of these indicators grouped by, for instance, heat and cold conditions, rain and drought conditions, snow and ice, wind, and also other conditions that are important for climate. So in particular, what we want to show here, this is a very complex, let's say, figure in the summary for policymakers, but I wanted to explain very briefly. What you are observing here in these different bars is the different indicators. Here, what I am highlighting is the indicators that are associated with temperatures. So for instance, is mean temperature, extreme heat, or for instance, extreme cold. So you can see that everything that is related to high temperatures is increasing in almost all the regions of the world, while the indices that are associated with cold temperatures are decreasing in almost all regions of the world. Another important feature, for instance, is that all these indices that are associated with cryosphere, for instance, what is the amount of sea ice extent, for instance, of the permafrost that is very important for climate, you can see that is decreasing in almost all regions where we have cryosphere. And all of these conditions that are related to the coast and the oceans, for instance, acidification, for instance, marine heat waves, for instance, relative sea level, is increasing in all the regions with importance of the coastal indices. So we can see general features in the regions of the world where we are observing projected changes in these different indices. So we are observing that some of these changes are happening. Some of them are irreversible. Sorry, because here I missed this slide. There is no going back from some changes in the climate system. We have to accept that. We have to acknowledge that some changes are totally irreversible. However, some changes could be slow and others could be stopped if we limit global warming. So for instance, changes in ocean, for instance, ocean temperature will continue increasing. Also, the melting of Greenland sea ice and ice sheet will be continue in the future. Also, sea level will continue to rise during centuries or even millennia, depending on the change. And there are other changes that are more low likelihood outcomes, which have a very low probability of occurrence. However, we cannot rule out that these events, for instance, ice sheet collapse, abrupt ocean circulation changes, some compound extreme events, we cannot rule out the occurrence of these changes. So that's why we have to take this into consideration. Also, an important finding in this report is that to limit global warming, we need a strong, rapid, and sustained reductions in the CO2, methane, and other greenhouse gases. This would not only reduce the consequences of climate change, but also improve air quality, including several co-benefits, for instance, in agricultural production, human health, for instance, etc. So just to show you that, I want to bring this plot from the Summary for Policymakers, What you are observing here is a very typical plot figure in the IPCC reports. Here you are seeing the level of increases of temperature, of global temperature. What I mentioned is that we are about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming at this point. And what you are seeing here in this axis is the cumulative CO2 emissions since the pre-industrial era, that is 1850 to 1900. So what you can see here is that, of course, temperatures have been increasing, and that is associated with increases in CO2 emissions. But when we see the different scenarios, these are the scenarios that I mentioned. These are the two scenarios with the highest emissions. This is the scenario that is compatible with the Paris Agreement. Then you can see that in terms of emissions, if we go to the strongest scenarios, we will have a stronger or a higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, which will leave us with higher temperatures, much higher temperatures in the planet. And then I'm going to show why it is important to, why we care about the level of global warming. And here just to show you that these two scenarios are the ones that have the lowest emissions and that could be compatible with the Paris Agreement. This one in particular with the 1.5 target. So at this point, I've been showing a little bit about the main results of the IPCC. You can check the report. It's thousands of pages where you have all the details about this. But as Christophe mentioned in the introduction, we wanted to give a complete view and let's say a complementary view of the implication of climate change and what is needed also to do, not only from the scientific perspective, but also from the human perspective. So here I wanted to show you that every single degree that the temperature increases matters. For instance, here we are observing what could happen if we reach 3 degrees Celsius of warming. That is actually not something crazy to think about because many countries are still emitting a lot of CO2 and a lot of greenhouse gases. And what you are seeing here is the level of risk. Let's say that the different regions in the world would experience in a world with 3 degrees Celsius. So you can see, for instance, that many regions, that is mainly the global south, are in red. It means high levels of risk. But you can also see many regions, for instance, in North America, for instance, in Europe, that have important risk related to this warming. So here what I wanted to say is that every ton of CO2 that we could reduce matters and contributes to additional global warming if you don't reduce those contributions. And every fraction of degrees matters. It means it could be like 1 degree Celsius is low. It's something that we don't feel if the temperature here is 28 or 29 degrees Celsius. But for the climate system is very, very important. And that is why we should check that we don't have these high temperatures. And something that we wanted to bring here is to think how are we doing with respect to the negotiations, the COP negotiations, the Paris Agreement negotiations. Are we on track to respect the Paris Agreement? The short and very concrete answer is no. We are improving in the negotiations. The different pledges, the national determined contributions have improved with respect to the 2015 contributions. They were updated last year or 2 years ago, 2020. They have improved, but we are still very far from the 1.5 degrees Celsius level that we want to reach. That is actually shown in this graph, where you can see this is the level that we would like to have, 1.5. 2 degrees Celsius is the highest top, the highest threshold that the Paris Agreement gives. And these are further higher temperatures. With the current policies and actions, we would be about 2.7 degrees Celsius, but with probability to have more than 3 degrees Celsius of global warming by the end of the century. And what the current pledges gives is an improvement because the temperatures wouldn't be that high as the current, let's say, the current policies that we have, but we are still far from the position that we have to have, that is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And in this map, you can see how the different countries are behaving with these different targets. You can see, for instance, in this gray, those are the countries that have a critically insufficient targets. So you can see, for instance, Russia. can see also countries with highly insufficient targets. You can see, for instance, Colombia, my country. You can see Brazil, which is very important in terms of emissions. Argentina, you can see here Mexico. You can see for instance, China, India, that are very important in terms of the future emissions. Australia. But you also have insufficient targets, and that's the case for mostly all Europe. So we still have a lot of work to do, because you can see that most of the countries, or at least most of the countries that emit the most, are still in insufficient targets. So it means that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of the negotiations. When we think, for instance, what do we need to do to reach the 1.5 target, and what is the different governments doing? We can see something that is very well discussed in this report. It's called the production gap. And I really recommend you to read this report, because this report shows us that while we need to do something like this, reduce emissions, CO2 emissions during this 21st century, this is what we need to do if we want to be in 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is what we need to do if we want to be in 2 degrees Celsius. And here is what we are currently doing, and what we are currently projecting to do, because many countries are still looking for oil, in general, for fossil fuels. For instance, in my country, Colombia, we are still betting for coal, for instance, as a transition fuel in Colombia. And you can see that with these policies, we will not reach. We are very, very far from the target that we want, and that is what is called the production gap. So in order to avoid this, what the scientific literature shows us is that we need that the vast majority of fossil fuels must stay in the grounds if you want to stem the climate crisis. This is, for instance, how much of the current reservoirs of coal, oil, and gas in the world must stay in ground. So you can see that 89% of the coal reserves, 58% of the oil reserves, and 59% of the gas reserves needs to stay in ground. And this is for countries. So you can see the different countries that possess a lot of reservoirs for oil. In this case, oil, this is coal, and this is gas. This is the percentage of these reservoirs that these countries need to live in ground. And then when we compare what is the current policy, we can see that this is something that is already not happening. So just to end, because it's not only a matter of fossil fuels, it's also a matter, for instance, of deforestation, because we know that forests are a very important reservoir of carbon in general. Something that we already know is that, for instance, in the Brazilian Amazon, some regions are already behaving not as CO2 reserves or sinks, but as CO2 sources. And that is something very important, because that is related to deforestation. In the Brazilian Amazon, here you can see the amount of CO2 removal. This is the carbon emissions, and in purple or in pink, you can see the difference. You can see that this region, the Brazilian Amazon, is behaving as a source of carbon, and that is very important in the climate system. And when we see which of this part of the Brazilian Amazon are emitting the most, then we can see that it's not the protected areas, it's not the indigenous territories, it's all the territories that are actually none of these. So those that are related to mining, related to agriculture, really, related to cattle. So it means that we really need to stop deforestation, because it's causing a lot of the climate change that we are observing, particularly at regional level. And this has a lot of implications regarding, for instance, biodiversity. So we will continue discussing, for instance, about this problem of carbon emissions.
Thanks, Paola. I will continue with the last part of the talk. So we showed you that climate change should not be treated as a geophysical scientific issue only, but instead through the prism of a political issue, and through the prism of what we call the carbon inequality. And I just want to conclude with this. So reminding you that, as Paula just said, that fossil fuels for about 85% and land use, mostly deforestation, as Paula mentioned, are responsible unequivocally for the observed climate change. And here on this graph, you can see the evolution of the emission of CO2 as a function of time from pre-industrial time to up to now, with the different source of emission, and especially fossil fuels, with the coal representing about 40%, the oil representing about 30%, and the gas 19%, about 20% of the share in the emission, which is expressed here in gigaton of carbon. So after COVID, I guess that everybody knows that what the term exponential means. And when you see the evolution of the CO2 emission, this is clearly an exponential rise. And the challenge is really not to reduce the emission of CO2, but to completely cut this emission of CO2. Because, as Paula mentioned, we know, and it's unequivocal, this is hard to say in French, and this is an established fact, that human activities are responsible for the warming, but human activities, as we go further in this report, and we show that human activities are responsible for all the warming, the famous 1.5 degrees that Paula mentioned, which corresponds to the warming of the last decades. So not a third of the warming or half of the warming is attributable to human activities. 100% of the warming is attributable to the human activities. So our future depends on our ability to abandon almost entirely, and the fastest way possible, all fossil fuels energy in order to stabilize global warming, as well as deforestation. And this is so almost entirely means that we need to reach what we call the net zero level, which is the only solution. So the net zero means that we need to stop any accumulation of CO2 molecules in the atmosphere. So we need to reduce drastically our emission, and we need to compensate the residual of the emission that we cannot cut because of our need. But we need to reduce the emission by about 85% at the lead time of 2050 to meet the Paris Agreement. So we need to go to net zero or carbon neutrality, as we said, but we need to go to net zero carbon neutrality, but the real one, not the greenwashed one that we are seeing everywhere. For instance, I don't know in Colombia, but in France, here we can see that some airports are going to be neutral in carbon, which is completely stupid and idiots and greenwashed. What we need here is carbon neutrality at global scale and no compensation as well. What we need also is to reduce our emission the fastest way possible, because as Paula said, what matters is the cumulative CO2 in the atmosphere. It's not the emission that our emission of today matters, of course, but what matters is the accumulation of the CO2 since the beginning of pre-industrial time. So the fastest way possible is necessary because the trajectory of our decrease in emission matters a lot. It means that we need to start now and not wait for the next 2 decades or the next decades, because the accumulation of carbon will increase and we cannot go back. There is irreversible status of climate on this. This net zero emission is often treated as a political objective, at least in the French policy. I just want to stress here that it's not a political target or not a political objective. It is a physical constraint. It is dictated by the physical laws, and you cannot negotiate with the net zero. Net zero is the only solution if we want to stop global warming. So in this context, climate policy with this emergency framework requires lucidity, honesty, ethics, and solidarity. And to translate this, I've written, if the transition is not fair, it will probably never happen. And this is what we call the carbon inequality. We need to have a fair treatment of this carbon inequality in order to solve or to limit the global warming. So climate change is not a geophysical equation only, but it is a very multifaceted inequality issue. And the first one is the inequalities in the contribution to cause global warming. So this inequality in contribution is due to the fact that the past emissions are very unequal between countries. So there is some historical responsibility, because I say that what matters is the cumulative CO2. So some countries are more responsible of the warming than others. And also within countries, what is discriminant is the income of the people. And I just want to address these two issues in the last part of the talk. Just to, oops, I've lost my slide, my mouse. Okay, can you? Yes. Just to emphasize this this part, which is very important. Don't be fooled by simplistic and fallacious argument. In the political debate here in France, we hear a lot about the different contribution of the countries in the CO2 emissions. And here on these two graphs, I'm showing you two different ways to treat the emission of CO2 that we observed over the planet. So on the left side, this is the emission for the 7 most emitted countries in the world. So per country, this is shown from 1960 to 2020. And it is expressed in gigaton, so in gigaton of carbon, in billions of tons of carbon. And so you can see the history of the emission. And so per country, you can really see that China today is the most emitted country by far, and with a very rapid increase of emission since 2000. The other countries are relatively flat, especially for the US and EU. India is increasing a bit, but Russia and Japan are also relatively flat. So this is if you count by country, but it's not fair to count this by country. What is fair is what is more fairer, I don't know, is to count it by capita. So in that case, by inhabitants, you can really see that China is not the most emitted country anymore, but China in orange here, it's very close to European countries actually. And US and Russia are the most emitted country in the world. If you count this way, the EU and France is in the middle, in the average of the EU contribution, is more than the world average. Especially at the end. China is a little bit more. But this is not really fair, because what matters also is the way of life of the people. And here you need to correct this emission by inhabitants or by capita. You need to correct it by taking into account the international commercial trades, because the goods that we buy here in Europe or in North America or in so-called developed countries, this is such a bad adjective. The goods that we buy are produced in China or in different countries. So this is what we call the delocalization of carbon, and we need to correct this. And in that case, if you correct by the trade and the commercial trades, a European emits more CO2 than Chinese. So in this political debate that we hear a lot here in France during this presidential campaign, when we do the Chinese bashing or other countries bashing. This is not fair. This is not the correct way to present the figures and the issues. Another, as I said before, so in addition to the delocalization of carbon, there is some historical responsibility in emission, because what matters is the cumulative emissions since the pre-industrial time. So on the left side of this slide, you can see by continents, different colors by continents. You can see the emission, the actual emission today, with in red Asia and in particular China emitting a lot. But if you consider the cumulative emission, which is on the right side, then China is not at the top level anymore, and US is the first one, and then Europe, and in that regard, France. If you take this historical component, France is as the 8th position. So in this world, most responsible of global warming. And France is in capacity of action. And so there's an ethical duty here of our country to cut the most possible out the emission and help the other country to not to engage in this very emitting policy. So I talk about the inequality, the carbon inequality in terms of responsibility, in terms of in global warming, in terms of countries. And now I'm going to just to finish with the carbon, what we call the carbon inequality dinosaurs, which shows here that the emission of carbon is very dependent on your income and the level of wealth. And in this plot here, what is shown is the growth of the emission of CO2 between 1990 and 2015, I think, you can see in the plot, ranked as a function of the income, with on the right side the 5 poorest people on community on Earth, and on the right side the 5 richest community. And so you can see that most of the increase of carbon in the last 25 years is attributable to the 5 richest people on Earth. And if you draw this is what we call the dinosaurs figure, because the increase is huge on the last what we call ventile, which is the 5% category of the people. What is important beyond the rate of change is the actual emission. The poorest 50% of the world are responsible only for 8% of the total CO2 emissions. The middle 40% are responsible for about 42% of the total CO2 emission. And the richest 10% are responsible for about 50% of the total emission. So you can really see the what we call the carbon inequality here. And it is also the case within country, and I'm just finishing with the example of France, where in France, I can see it, but if my memory is good, in France, the richest 10% emit 3 times more than the poorest 10%. So you can really see here that the climate equation, the climate change equation, is not only a geophysical issue, but really a political and social issue. And I just want to complete the carbon inequality that I've documented here. The first one being the inequality in contribution of climate change, but there are many others, and especially so the inequalities related to what we call exposure to the effects of climate change, both between countries, because usually the southern countries or the tropical countries are more exposed than the northern countries, and also within countries. and also inequalities in vulnerability, which, for instance, access to solidarity insurance mechanism, and so on and so on. There are also inequalities facing adaptation and mitigation strategy, because choices in action can either amplify pre-existing inequalities, with the cost or burden falling more heavily on the poorest household. For instance, the regressive carbon tax. This is what we had here in France, the carbon tax that was implemented in 2018, which led to the so-called yellow jacket movement, where the tax was fell more heavily on the poorest, and was in that case was not fair. Or there are also actions possible to correct the inequality. For instance, related to the energy precarity, which can be reduced. The good carbon tax can be interesting. And also the level of capacity of action between countries and within countries, which is also a source of inequalities. And finally, there's also inequalities in access to decision making, and especially the way the access to the policy, and so to kind of lobbying for the policy implementation. So it doesn't work. Just to conclude, I would say, so climate change is not a scientific but a political problem. And I just want to finish this, and we don't have time to develop this. But in this context, technology, including efficiency techniques of carbon dioxide removal, what we call CDR, will help us a bit in the future, but it's not going to save us. This is not very clear. And so climate change should involve a profound change in making society. And I will let Paula finish with the last slide.
So just to conclude, this last slide is an invitation. It's an invitation to change the system. As we have exposed here, climate change is not only a physical change. We can try to be very simplistic, saying that climate change is only the change in climate, and that has some implications. But we can see that not only the implications, the consequences, but the causes of climate change are associated with the current system that rules the world. And we need to change that system. If we want to really face climate change, we need to change society, as Christophe was saying at the end. And this is an invitation. I think the idea with this talk today, with these different views that we have as European and South American scientists and citizens, I think it is important to also question our role as human beings, as inhabitants of our countries, because we really need a systemic change. Climate change, the solution is not only a technological, a technocratic change, is a system change. This is systematic. This is a systemic change. So we really need to tackle that. So that was our main invitation during this talk. Many thanks for this invitation.
Thank you very much, Paula and Christophe. So we will begin the question and answer session. So if you want to ask a question, please type it in the chat box. I agree with most of you. You always emphasize on the quality of the interventions of Christophe and Paula. It's extremely interesting, and we have a lot of questions. Just before beginning the question, I would like to let know that we have a survey, an online survey, which will help us improve our events and the importance of environmental issues in education. So it's in French. It's just take less than 5 minutes. So during the please feel free to click here on the link I put in the chat box and answer this survey, because it's very helpful for us. Okay, so here I'm going to switch to the question and answer mode, and I will let Anne ask you some questions, because I'm just looking for her questions. She had a lot. they are here. So Anne, I let you speak directly to Christophe and Paola. Here are your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was definitely really interesting. And I just would like you to give a word on the model you produce. Is it a unique model with all different labs all together, or do you have many models and then many results? And also how the different type of discipline and researchers work together, from one working on physical, I don't know, meteorological forecast, and the other about, I don't know, population moving and human science, I don't know. So many different disciplines working together. How does it really work?
Christophe, do you want to reply to the model?
Okay, I can take the model. So there is not only one model. There are many models that we consider in this report. I would say that we are a well-organized community because we managed to provide framework and background for coordinated experiments between labs and between different groups. So basically, we spend a lot of time in setting protocols, and these protocols are shared by all the labs all over the world. So we have different models, but the scenarios are the same, and all models follow the same scenarios and produce a different outcome of climate. And so there are about 40 models, if my memory is correct. And this is a way to assess the uncertainties associated with each model and with the modeling of climate. We spend almost more time in setting protocols than in running models, actually. And what is also important is we have a common format also for model outputs. So it means that all over the world, the models output can be used in a transparent way. And this is very useful, and it helps a lot to do the analysis. What I want to stress is that the climate model are usually, the history of the climate model, they come from atmospheric model and from weather forecasts at the beginning. So they are the same models, but they are degraded in resolution, I would say, because we integrate the models for a long period of time and not only for a few days, like the weather forecast. So we did degrade the spatial resolution of this model. So they are typically the resolution is typically of 100 kilometers, between 50 kilometers and 100 kilometers, with respect compared to a weather forecast, which is about 2 kilometers. But it is the same core, it is the same physics behind. And the atmospheric model is coupled to ocean models, to ice models, to biosphere model, to geophysical model. And this is what we call Earth system model, and gathering all the disciplines, as you said. And then this is why we need expertise from many authors to analyze and to assess the performance of this model. And the last word is that as an IPCC author, I learn a lot actually from my colleagues because we don't know everything. We have expertise on our subject, and it's very interesting to hear the expertise of others, to ask stupid questions sometimes. Stupid questions for them, but not for us, but not for them, and so it's a learning process, and I would say we build competence, ability in our subject as being an IPCC report. I learn a lot, for instance, from chapter 8 people, from chapter 8 authors related to the hydrological cycle. Paola, can you?
Yeah, thank you. It was great.
I can complement, for instance, on what are the different disciplines and how we interact in the report. As Christophe mentioned, there is a first step of every assessment report, which is the scoping meeting. So there it is decided what are the different chapters of the different working groups. So when we postulate, we are nominated as authors, we already know which are the chapters, and we choose, okay, I would like to be involved in this chapter or in this chapter, and then the IPCC Bureau select the authors. So when you are in the report, you already know in which chapter are you going to be involved. So in my case, I was involved in chapter 8, that is water cycle changes. But then there in my chapter, we were 16 authors from 15 different countries, different cultures, different languages. Actually, many of us were not English native speakers, but from China, from Russia, from Europe, many countries in the world. And then with different disciplines. In the physics, let's say more in the physical sciences, more chemistry, physics. I am an engineer, for instance. But we then needed to start developing the chapter. The same happened, for instance, in the chapter that Christophe was involved in. And there you start having a lot of discussions. What is the best way to write the chapter? Because also we knew not only the title of the chapter, but also the content, because the governments decide what content they want to see in the chapters. So for instance, for the water cycle, they wanted to see what is happening with the irrigation. They wanted to see what is happening with evapotranspiration, with water vapor, with many things that we have to include in the chapter. So these 3.5 years that we were working in the chapters, we were developing like all the structure, trying to cover all the topics. Also, we had a lot of interaction with other chapters, because, for instance, water cycle includes many things. There is one chapter that is extreme. It's about extreme weather and climate. So that is part of the water cycle. So we have to discuss which topics we're going to be covered in one chapter or in another one, if we were going to have different thresholds in the chapters, whatever. So I think it was a very, very interesting experience because we were scientists with different experiences. You can see, actually, I saw many authors that were the ones that I used to read the papers. So I was, okay, that is this person. It was very exciting, but also very challenging. Try to put together in this very complex process, also with the pandemics in the middle that made everything harder. But it was totally a worth it experience.
So maybe I can make the most to put another question from Margot. And it's given the fact that governments take part in the revision of the report, even though it's transparent, to what extent is the report not biased by them and their personal interest? She finds it strange that government take part of the process while the IPCC is not supposed to be a political tool. I don't know, Christophe or Paola.
Shall I start, Paola? Yeah, it is a fair question, actually. What is important is to know that the summary for policymakers, this is where the government really take part. The summary for policymakers is written by a group of authors, a subgroup of authors of the report. It's written by scientists. It's not written by the government. It's proposed to the government, and then the government, in the approval session, what the delegates from the government do is they just challenge the scientist on the relevance, pertinence, on the traceability of the conclusion they have written in the summary for policymakers. For instance, if I take the example of the established fact that we ended in the human influence is unequivocally responsible for human activities, we had a lot of discussion, a lot of questions from government to really prove that human influence is indeed unequivocally responsible for the global warming. So they challenge the scientists, I would say, but they cannot change the scientific conclusion. They cannot change the scientific content because science is not negotiable. They can change they can propose forms to change the formulations to make it clearer or to emphasize some points or lower some other aspects. And then it's just a discussion with the government. For instance, I'm coming back again on this unequivocal responsibility of human activity, because this is related to my chapter, and this is for the sentence on which I worked a lot. Actually, the original sentence that we wrote in the summary for policymaker was weaker than the one adopted at the end of the approval session, because some governments really they read the entire report and they say that we can go, according to the assessment as well, we can go a step further in the evaluation, and this is really what was true. It was really true in that case. So the government don't change the conclusion; they just change the formulation, and it's this co-building process is very important, because at the end, because it's approved at unanimity, then the summary for policymaker. It's not only an IPCC summary for policymaker, I would say. To me, it's a citizen. It's a summary for policymaker. It's a summary for citizens, because the government approve the report in the name of their citizens. So by this mean, it's not a pure science report. It's also a citizen report, and I think it's very important to have this co-building process. But this is my personal view.
Okay, and so going to another question, since the government is trying to challenge the scientists, so who are the governmental experts implicated in the approval of the summary for policymaker? Are they always part of the government, or in which case governments are supposed to be briefed very well on the reports? Who are the scientists from the government parts?
I can help with this question. So the focal points are generally, at least in South America, the meteorological institutes or the environmental ministry. People involved in this ministry or in the meteorological institutes are the delegates that are going to the approvals. That was the case for many countries in America, as I could check. And when you see the composition of the delegations, you can see that they are not actually politicians, at least the ones I could check. They are more people that is having like an administrative role in the different dependents where they belong. I could also see some scientists. For instance, I saw some countries where scientists that I know are involved in the delegation of the government. And there were also some countries that had people more involved in let's say in politics. So it is a mixture. The different delegations have a mixture of people with different experiences. For instance, I could see very strong people in the scientific aspects. I mean, not people that is interested in political things, but that they know about science. They tackle a lot different concepts within the report about, for instance, droughts. There are different types of droughts. We have to be careful with that. So you can see a lot of experience in some of the delegations, people from the delegations that have a scientific background. And also people that is more related to the decision making. So they were also trying to make suggestions and comments that are regarding or related to decision making. So that's what I could see. I was very curious. I have the same question that Liselott is asking, because I didn't know about this process, and then I could see different approaches in the delegations.
Okay. So
maybe,
now let's go. Sorry, Christophe. Yes.
Yeah, maybe I just can add something for France because just bouncing back on what Paula is saying. For France, the head of the delegation used to be the former director of research of Météo France. So it is a scientist. And the French delegation was composed of representatives for the Ministry of Research, Ministry of the Foreign Office, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ministry of Ecology. So this is the combined delegation. And as Paula said, I was really surprised. It was the first time for me as well to be part of the NAPROVAL session. And I was really surprised by the expertise and the understanding of the representatives of the delegates from the government. So maybe it's how do you say in English, un abus de langage, to say that governments are implicated in this approval process. This is the delegates from the government. It's not the government by themselves, and they know a lot about climate.
That makes it clearer. Perfect. So here we have a very technical question. It's from Sarah, who is a PhD student in Italy. Did the 2021 IPCC report focused on scientific researches related to assessing the local scale impact of climate change, such as using downscaling approaches to better modeling the impact of climate change on different natural resources? I don't know who would like to answer to this question, Christophe or Paula?
I can start. I am sure that Christophe can complement the answer. Yes, actually, something that is very amazing in these reports, at least for the climate report, is that the IPCC uses all the different type of evidences that are available. So we use paleoclimate, we use observations, we use theory, because we know theory, we know physics, we know chemistry, and that is something that we include. And we use also models, but not only general circulation models, like the large scale models, but also regional models, for instance, as a tool to perform regional downscaling, as Sarah is suggesting. So yes, the regional models and not only like dynamical downscaling, but also statistical downscaling, studies that are based on statistical downscaling were also considered in the assessment. So remember that we in the IPCC, we do not run the models, we do not make the analysis. What we do is that we analyze the literature. So we use literature that uses regional models, that uses statistical downscaling in order to assess the regional responses of climate change. I suggest you to read the Atlas chapter. That chapter has different sections by continent. And one of the sections, when we go, for instance, for Europe, then they analyze observational changes. They also analyze how models are improving or not in the region. So, for instance, that is something important that the Atlas brings, and other chapters also developed, because indeed, downscaling is a very important tool in order to assess the impacts of climate change at a more regional level.
Maybe just to complement what Paula said, I would also just suggest to read another chapter, which is chapter 10. Chapter 10 is devoted to the methodology to assess or to bring signal from global scale to regional scale. And especially using, so as Paula said, multiple lines of evidence based on observation, based on regional model, based on different downscaling techniques. But this methodology, this methodological chapter is very important to go across scale, I would say. These chapters are very technical, I would say, but they start with 2 pages of what we call executive summaries that can be interesting to read. They are more accessible to public. And also there is what we call the technical summary, which is about a 100-page chapter. No, it's not chapter, but it's it's a summary, technical summary, and it's the level of the summary, the level of knowledge. I mean, the target of the technical summary is for education, for university, for students. So it's also interesting to read, I think, if you want to know more about the different methodology and the different approaches that we use.
Thank you very much for answering this question. Now, Guillaume asks us, how can we be sure that a hazard is linked to climate change and not to climate? For example, we recently talked about the first starvation in Madagascar linked to climate change, but how can we verify it?
Shall I start, Paola? Okay, there is a really novelty in this IPCC report about what we call the attribution of extreme events. This is an initiative that started about 6 to 5 years ago, which tries to estimate the change of probability of these events to occur due to human influence. Because this question is really fair in the sense that, for instance, heat waves. There were heat waves before in the past, and they were even in the Middle Age, even during the Little Ice Age, for instance. They were heat waves, and they were not related to human influence. Today, heat waves occur, and I would say that human influence on human activities can be treated as a booster or as a doping effect. So it changes the statistics of the event, the frequency, the intensity, the special occurrence, and this is the way we assess the human impact on these extreme events. We look at the statistics, the change in the statistics associated with the extreme events. And we use observation, and we use also models. And the beauty with models is that we can run them in different configuration. So we run the models in what we call pre-industrial time, with no human activity and the level of concentration of CO2 or greenhouse gases fixed at a constant level, which is the so-called pre-industrial time, which is around 1850. So we run the model and we compute the statistics of the events, of the extreme events, of any type of events. And then we run the same models with different, with the observed change in CO2 concentration due to human activity, and we compare the statistics. And we can really see if these statistics are changed. For the Madagascar, there is a website devoted to this type of attribution of extreme events. If you type this on the web, or if I have time, I can type it on the chat. You will find it. For the Madagascar episode, actually, this is one of the events where climate change does not have a great influence, according to our analysis. Meaning that the drought in Madagascar can occur because this is what we call natural variability. Natural variability means that climate can produce spontaneously, without any forcing, any change, its own variability. This is weather is the perfect example of natural variability. So natural variability can occur at weather scale, can occur at climate scale, with long period of drought, decadal drought, or decadal cooling, for instance. And apparently Madagascar is one of the place where it's very hard to extract the human influence on what is observed, and which is compatible with internal variability or natural variability. I don't know if I've been clear.
Yeah, I think it was clear.
Okay.
Paola, do you want to complement it, or should we move to the next question by Philippe?
No, we can move to the next question.
Okay. So Philippe says that fighting against change implies strong and clear choices regarding the production of energy. So in your opinion, what will be an ideal mix for limiting climate change, limiting risk, and optimizing?
Okay, I can start. with my point of view. This is not an IPCC point of view, it's my point of view. I really think that we need to question the consumption of energy. That is something that we should start with, because sometimes we just try to rely on, for instance, renewable energies or other type of energies. And as we mentioned at the end of this conversation, we mentioned that this is a systemic change that is caused by a system that is operating. And when you start thinking, for instance, about renewable energies, the main speech, let's say institutional speech, government speech in the different countries is, yes, we need to improve the technology for renewable energy. Then we start talking then about solar energy, about wind energy and all these type of energies. But we don't question how are we going to produce that type of energy. And the thing is, the reality is that many of these energies are actually based in the same type of approach than the fossil fuel energy, because it's based, for instance, in the exploitation, in the use of natural resources as lithium or as many other resources. And the mines, for instance, are located in the global south, in China, in Chile, in Argentina, with indigenous people living there, and the extraction is exactly the same than for the fossil fuels, living poverty, living in inequity, adding to vulnerability in the regions. So I think the really question here is, how are we going to change this system? And one part also is, do we need to consume the same amount of energy that we are needing, that we are currently demanding? I think that is something that we have to question, and that is something that also highlights, for instance, that is very different to talk about a country like France, for instance, in comparison to a country like Cameroon, or to Colombia, or to other countries. So we really have to check that, and I think that the solution has to include technology. For sure we need technology, but I think we also need this social component that we most of the times are avoided in the discussion that the governments are giving, because we are too focused in the technology and we are totally far away of the human aspect. Climate change is a collapse of the system. Climate change is not only an environmental problem.
Christophe?
I will complement a little bit. I fully agree with what Paula just said. First is to question the relationship that we have with energy, and in terms of society, and we cannot avoid any reduction of our consumption of energy in the future. There is not a single scenario compatible with the Paris Agreement, where the consumption of energy is where the increase of the consumption of energy is possible. Also, maybe it's a French bias, but we need to make the difference between energy and electricity. Because in France, there is a confusion between energy and electricity, especially in the political debates that we have right now. The electricity is just part of the energy consumption, and in France, if my memory is correct, I think it's 20 or 25% is electricity, and the rest is agriculture, it's transport, it's heating. It's so we need to we need to move back the debate to to including all the question related to energy and not the question related to electricity. And in that case, as Paula mentioned, the social component of the relationship with the energy is crucial. For instance, in France, it is absolutely nonsense to think about replacing all the cars by the fossil fuel cars or the petrol cars, by electrical cars, if we don't think about the way people move and the way people travel between their home and their office, their workplace, the mobility. Questioning the energy without questioning the mobility is completely nonsense. So this is where the social aspect comes into the place. And as Paola said, and at least in France, in the political debate right now, this social aspects of climate change is not really addressed, I would say, or commented, and mostly technical. Okay. And it's too bad.
So then I will ask a question about that, but I will switch to this one by Margot. Because I think it's very interesting. Given the inequalities in the climate change crisis, do you think that tackling the issue at an international scale with the COP, for example, the COP, is the better way to do it, or should it be done at a local scale? Is it better to tackle environmental issue at the international level or at the local scale?
I consider that we need all of them. Of course, we need an international agreement because this is, for instance, I think about Colombia. Colombia has a lot of responsibilities regarding the impacts of climate change here, right? Because the way that we use land, because of the economical activities that we have here. But if we think about the problem of the emissions are not from Colombia. Colombia has less than 1% of the global emissions. So the emissions are the responsibility of other countries, right? So that's why we really need a global agreement. However, I consider that COP is not particularly the best way to do this, because COP is still, let's say, based in the same system. We are discussing about the same ideas. The COPs are not questioning and are not providing, in my opinion, lights for other discussions that, for instance, include local communities, that includes indigenous people. I mean, they are starting to have this, but it's still, in my opinion, from a greenwashing perspective. I think this needs to be tackled. I really think that we need a different perspective to approach these discussions. We have already 26 COPs. 33 years ago, the IPCC was created. And during these 3 decades, the emissions of CO2 have been increasing with non-stop. So it really shows that these negotiations are not working. They are not working at all. So I think we really need a change in the way that the negotiations are made.
Shall I complement a little bit? I think we need everything. I think we should not propose internal scale and local scale, because they interact each other, and so local scales or citizens or communities can make some pressure on governments, and that can have a translation. This pressure can be translated into the COP. And on the other way, I mean, the COP can implement some policy. What is important to me during the COP, it's not the agreement at the end of the COP per se, but the discussion between the countries during the COP. For instance, for the last one, there were some agreements between some countries, not all the countries, about certain type of policy that can be more important than the COP itself. I mean, the Glasgow Pact, the Climate Pact, the Glasgow Climate Pact, as it is called. So it's not with model. We cannot play with reality and come back to the future. But the question would be, how would the world be without the COP? And maybe it could be worse. Maybe it could be better. We don't know. But I want to bring a little bit of optimistic here. Optimism here. If we look at the world before, let's say in 2010, and if you look at the policy that were applied at that time, the increase of CO2, the forecasted increase of CO2, the planned increase of CO2 for the 2010 decades and 2020 decades was much larger than what is observed. And so this can be due to some discussion with the COP. It's not enough, but it's a step, I would say. But the main message I want to convey is don't oppose the two scales.
Two scales, okay. And now I would like to ask you a question. It's because I think many of us, even if nobody wrote it, many of us are wondering at the micro level scale. For example, me, my household, Alexis, I work in IMT Minalvi. What can I do as a citizen, as a human being, to get things better, to get things done, to limitate the climate change, even if it's just a drop of water in the ocean? What would you advise me and maybe all the audience to do or to consider?
I can start. I think what we are doing here is very important. First, to approach to this, to discuss what is happening, also to understand the different phases of climate change. And also, I think that something very important is to start questioning our own behavior in certain things. Something that we haven't mentioned here is, for instance, how the food system, the global food system, is one of the main reasons behind fossil fuel use, right? Is food. We are talking about energy. We are consuming energy because our body needs energy. And how are we consuming this energy? Where is this energy coming from? So, for instance, something that is important, I think, is one of the things that I have as a scientist and in my experience in the IPCC, I have been trying to change is, for instance, the way I eat, because that is a political action. That is a political act that you can take. You can decide whether you eat some type of food or not. Where is that food produced? Because that is something that we don't question. We just go to the market and buy something, but we don't care about where is this produced, where this come from. So I think that is something important, because these habits in feeding is something that we really need to change. There is a special report on land use that the IPCC published in 2019. I really encourage you to take a look of this report, because that is something important, for instance, about the different type of diets that could help us, for instance, to mitigate climate change. But also, I would finish saying that this is a political issue. I mean, we are talking about something that is a system problem, and the solution cannot avoid the political aspects. Politics is very important here, and we are political subjects. So sometimes we are afraid to take a political position, to also have a political view on this, but we have to have it. We also need political education. And in that case, I think, for instance, France, and Colombia are expecting elections, presidential elections this year. So what are the candidates talking about? What is the main idea that they have? We have also to make pressure on the candidates and on the future presidents to make changes in this regard. And that is a very individual act that could help to tackle this crisis. So I think we have to take responsibility in the way that we are political subjects, but we also have to keep in mind that the main cause of this is fossil fuels, big companies, huge companies, and we have to question that, and we also have to demand the governments to make actions to reduce emissions and to change what is happening now.
Perfect. Christophe, do you want to add something, or
yeah, just want to add something. First thing is every action matters. So there is no small actions, because as we showed you, every tons of CO2 matters, every fraction of degrees matters. So every action matters. So it's very important to keep this in mind and don't be desperate, because it can lead to what we call a doomism, which can be defined as, okay, it's too late and we cannot do anything. So don't be desperate. Every action matters, even the small one. I completely agree with Paola in the fact that we are a political subject. We are a political object, all of us. And one action is, of course, the vote. And there are different policy that are planned, and so a vote is an action. Activism is another one, because sometimes, at least in face of, against climate change, or in face of this very challenge of the change of climate change, it's very easy to get desperate, to feel alone, and one way to get boosted is really to talk to people, to exchange with people, to exchange the difficulties that we have to reduce our carbon footprint, to build on experiences that people had. And it is always rewarding to do that. So don't stay alone, I would say, in your small actions. Talk to people. And in a very practical way, I would suggest to compute your own carbon budget. And this is very, very helpful to realize which part of your way of life produce the most of carbon, and on which sector you can play with. There is a very, at least for France, there is a very nice tool on the ADEME website. And then you have different, it helps you to compute the carbon footprint, the way based on the way you move, the way you eat, you go to work, and so on and so on. It's very interesting. Personally, I've done it, and just by doing it, I realized that my main source of emission was not the one I expected, but another one, and I could play with it and reduce by 20% my carbon footprint without going back to middle age.
Maybe if you have the link, you can put it in the chat box. So if I sum up, you asked, I don't know if you know this legend of the colibri hummingbird by Pierre Rabhi, who died some days ago, unfortunately. So we have to make our part, even if it's a small one. If I understand well, we have to make our part. And the last question, it's very interesting, and I think also everyone is wondering. It's by Liselot. It must be very interesting and motivating and inspiring for you to be part of the IPCC. But it must be also very frustrating at moments. So has it affected your personal motivation to be part of the IPCC?
I can start. I would say that it has increased my motivation. Of course, sometimes I feel frustrated, mainly because of the actions. For instance, I live in a country that has opened the door to fracking, for instance, that is thinking about coal as the fuel for the transition. That is something that is in a national law in Colombia. So of course I feel frustrated when I see what is happening in reality, and when I also know, as a scientist and also as a human being that is observing what is happening in my country, for instance. But during the recent years, I feel a strengthened motivation. I really agree with Christophe, with what he said about activism. I think sometimes we are very afraid to say that we are involved in activism, but there are many ways to be active in this. And I think my experience in the IPCC has strengthened my scientific perspective, but also has helped me to open my eyes that we really need many other things different to what the IPCC offers, and that is something that also I have to try to look as an individual, and also with a collective of scientists that think the same, for instance, like Christophe. So I really think this has been an experience that most of all has strengthened my motivation, despite of the frustration and the anger that sometimes you can feel. But I think it's also the proof that we really need to do something. This is not time to be neutral. This is not time to be quiet and do nothing. This is a time for action, in my opinion.
Christophe, we leave you the last words.
How can I say? Yeah, I think my motivation is higher as well, because I think that, I mean, to me, this report is kind of a slap on my face, because we know that we knew for a long time that climate was changing, but having been an authors will allow you to have this broad perspective on the climate change, on the climate system, and actually you see that all parts of the climate system is affected by climate change, and is affected by human activities. And this systemic change of the climate, to me, is a slap on the face of my face, even if I was I knew it before. So my motivation is higher because I think we are facing a danger, and I think that as IPCC authors, we have a responsibility to communicate about this danger, and I don't know. I mean, this is a personal view, and this is not completely shared by some colleagues, but and I agree with Paula that I think neutrality today, on being neutral today, is first an illusion, and second, in face of a danger, I would say there is some ethical, some ethics issue related to this type of neutrality. So to me, I'm more motivated, and I'm frustrated, when people, some politicians or some decision makers or some people, just treat climate change as to be provocative, I would say, as a number of a figure on an Excel file that we can play with, and we can. They think that it's like a political or economical issues where there is a debt and you can increase the debt, and it's just something which is an Excel file, which is written in an Excel file, and you can erase the debt, or you can generate money. So you cannot negotiate with physics. You cannot negotiate with CO2 emissions and accumulation in the atmosphere. So I feel a lot of frustration, but I think it's our duty. Again, it's my own opinion. It's our duty of IPCC to convey the message that we are facing a danger, but it's still we still have time, if we act now, to limit climate change. We cannot go back, as Paula said. There are irreversible changes, but we can limit it if we act now.
Okay, so thank you very much, Christophe and Paula, and all of the audience, to participate. And I think, yes, it's very interesting for us, the general audience, the students, the professors, to hear directly from you. We will end this event because it's already been 2 hours since we began it, but it's extremely interesting, and we have a lot of message to thank you for your participation. So you will be able to see this video on our YouTube channel, IMT MineLB. And yeah, that's all for us. Christophe, Paula, I don't know if you have a last word to say, but it's now or never. Then it will be too late.
I will recall my invitation to be active and be part of the solution. I think that we are in changing times. The world has changed. This pandemic will show us that the world has changed, and we are part of the change. So it's an invitation to be part of this with all the knowledge, with the criteria, not in a arbitrary way, with the knowledge that also you as a students are collecting in your career. I think it's very important to make decisions in this perspective.
Yes, I would like to thank you very much, Christophe and Paola, for this very amazing and inspiring conference. And it's as a citizen, I would say this is very interesting to see that dedicated people like you work on the subject, because this is a bit frightening to see how the politicians in our country, but also in other countries, do not catch your conclusion as we could hope. And thank you very much for the hope you gave to us today, because you have also give some issues and some way to improve the situation. So this is very inspiring also. Thank you very much to have been with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the